Oh man, pour one out for 2020. This is the hardest intro for one of these things I've ever had to write. Normally, what I like to do is mention a few other nice things that happened in the given year before segueing into video games. Well, Unleash the Archers put out a new CD this year, and aside from that, I got nothing. Games were a bright spot in a trash fire of a year, so let's talk about them.
You're batshit insane!
The internet discourse around The Last of Us 2 was so bad at launch it might as well have been a new Star Wars movie. But this is my video, so prepare for a very lukewarm take on the matter. It was fine. First of all, I think that as far as gameplay and control are concerned, this game is indisputably better than the first. Ellie feels way more responsive and easy to handle than Joel did. The AI also received all the right improvements to just make the encounters more suspenseful. The game also presented a few scenarios where you're dealing with humans and infected at the same time, and I love having two sides that I can just instigate to kill each other. What I would do is I would just peg a human in the face with a bottle, clickers would swarm, and then chaos would unfold. Yeah, I got myself killed a few times doing it, but it was amusing enough that I just kept trying, and then it was very satisfying when I got it to work. But enough about that pesky gameplay, because that's not what people care about in the follow-up to Gaming Citizen Kane. They want to hear about the story, and without spoiling it, I respect what they did. They chose a story that they wanted to tell and stuck to it regardless of how people might feel about it. It would have been really easy to distill down what people liked about the first game and then just do it again. However, I feel like the pacing in the middle of this game took a massive nosedive. I wouldn't necessarily change what happens, I would just kind of change the order in which it's presented to you and how it happens. Because oftentimes it felt like the game was just going out of its way to slow itself down, and a few times I was like, wow, this is still happening. Contrast that with, the first game, from the end of the fall chapter all the way through winter into the end of the game, felt like it had a very natural crescendo to it, with these quieter moments built in between all of that, rather than going out of its way to just skid to a halt. But pacing issues aside, I still think the story was fine. It had some cool moments, for sure. I guess my final word on the matter is, if you're someone who's interested in The Last of Us 2, but might have been trepidatious about playing it because of all the negativity around it, I think you should check it out. Don't let what you've heard, positive or negative, decide for you. Play it for yourself and come to your own conclusion. A few years ago, I was exposed to Don't Nod through playing Life is Strange. My main takeaway from that game was, despite any flaws it may have had, it was a cool story with a world that I enjoyed existing in and interacting with. I can definitely say the same thing about Tell Me Why, except all of those flaws present in Life is Strange have almost entirely been polished out. The setup is about the twins Allison and Tyler reconnecting with each other after being separated from a young age. From there, some shenanigans unfold with a touch of the typical supernatural hijinks that Don't Nod likes to put in their games. I believe that just about everything in this game is a marked improvement from Don't Nod's previous work. The writing is better, all of the emotional moments actually feel appropriately impactful rather than just some overblown teenage melodrama. Characters are all great too, they all feel fleshed out, and I grew to like a lot of them more than my initial impression led me to believe I would. Allison and Tyler, the two lead characters, were especially well written, and I felt like their relationship was very believable and human. This is helped by the impeccable performances of Erica Lindbeck and August Aiden Black respectively. I think another thing that really helped this game was that its pacing was better. It was only 3 episodes instead of 5, and I believe that with Life is Strange, for example, one episode in particular didn't exactly feel like filler, but if you were to take the amount of filler in all of the episodes collectively, then you'd have an episode of filler. Having only 3 episodes in this game helped it feel much more cohesive and like it was always moving. So overall, the polished writing, great performances, and critically, an ending that doesn't drop the ball, they tell me why a fun time to sink a weekend into. Well, it's about time. We haven't had a new mainline Crash Bandicoot game in a metric eon, and it's been even longer since there was one actually worth your time. So how does Crash Bandicoot 4 stack up to the platforming greats of old? Pretty decently, I'd say. The characters are lively and cool, the level design is striking, each level manages to have its own visual identity, even when they happen to be themed similarly. As far as the actual platforming in the levels, I'd say it's pretty good. Honestly, the game reminds me as much of a modern platformer like Celeste as it does the older Crash Bandicoot games, with a little bit of Donkey Kong sprinkled in there because of blindly jumping into pits hoping to get some boxes. The core mechanics of the game get built on by the 4 quantum masks, the magical MacGuffins, and they add a bit of spice to the levels that's pretty cool. They work as a kind of trade-off for not getting any power-ups after the bosses. Lonnie Lowly has this cool kind of phase-shifting power. Akano has a tornado spin on steroids, essentially. Kapunawa slows time down, and Ika Ika reverses gravity. All of them get some pretty solid uses throughout the game, but I feel like it's the most satisfying when the game starts chaining together Quantum Mask segments one after another. The other new major gameplay element is that it boasts 3 other playable characters outside of Crash and Coco. We also get to play as Cortex, Tawna, and Dingodile. These characters are novel at first, but I feel like the only one that didn't wear out their welcome was Dingodile. The level design around Cortex especially seems to grind the pace to a halt, and with Tawna you're sort of at the mercy of her hookshot's auto-lock. Dingodile's levels actually seem to be built around his strengths though. He can suck up boxes with his leaf blower and send them shooting into other boxes. He also has a double jump and the ability to hover, which makes his toolset my favorite to use. This bears mentioning, but I would not recommend doing a completionist run of this game. I mentioned jumping blindly into pits hoping to get boxes. I couldn't even get all the box gems in this game because they hid like a dozen of them off screen all the time. I just accepted that and played the game casually, as one would. But if you can do all this stuff and want to do all that stuff, more power to you. You'll definitely get your money's worth. Still, overall, I played exactly as much of the game as I wanted, and I think that it's still a solid experience that stands next to the classics. It's not even a full sequel, but I feel like this game is miles better than the 2018 game. Okay, so saying that is a bit hyperbolic, I just said it for the joke, but I do enjoy Spider-Man Miles Morales more than 2018's Spider-Man game. First of all, everything from that first game that was right carries over to this one, so the feeling of web swinging around New York is still just as satisfying. Miles Morales also has the same commitment to detail as the previous game. The best example of this is just watching the way Miles is animated. Seeing his less refined movements compared to Peter's just all makes sense because he's new to the whole crime fighting thing. Despite being newer at being Spider-Man though, I have to say, playing as Miles makes the combat more interesting. The combat is mostly the same, but with the added element of Miles' Venom powers, which uses some kind of bioelectricity hijinks to juice up a variety of Miles' moves. All of these Venom powers were quite helpful, and they prevented the combat from wearing out its welcome like it started to in the 2018 game. The stealth sections also received a pretty hefty improvement. You can actually do the whole encounter while stealthed if you're good enough, rather than clearing out a wave of thugs and then just being forced into a combat encounter for wave 2. Miles Morales trims the fat in a lot of other areas too. There aren't any annoying screwball challenges, and vitally, there are no main story beats where you're stuck in control of a character without superpowers. That was my biggest complaint about the other game, is that there were often times where I wasn't allowed to Spider-Man in the Spider-Man game. I think this, combined with the more focused and personal story, are what come together to make Spider-Man Miles Morales the superior Spider-Man experience. After striking gold with the Resident Evil 2 remake last year, Capcom struck again while the iron was hot, releasing the remake of Resident Evil 3 this year. Is it as good? Well, I like 2 more, but to be fair, I also liked the original 2 more than the original 3. I still think this game is good in its own right, though. It goes about getting its scares a little differently, where Resident Evil 2 was definitely the creepy and the quieter moments kind of horror. Resident Evil 3 takes a more adrenaline-fueled monster movie approach. As far as the gameplay goes, the controls are almost the same, save for this cool dodge maneuver that Jill can do. If you time it right, it can also be a perfect dodge, and oh man am I a sucker for a good slow-motion dodge mechanic. Naturally, as the game goes on, you become better equipped, picking up a shotgun and a grenade launcher. I found myself using the weapons a little bit more in this game. In the previous one, oftentimes I would just get by on manipulating movement patterns and not firing my ammo. Well, in this game there's a lot more enemies on the screen, so it's harder to pull off. And speaking of enemies, oh man, look what they did with Nemesis. In the original version of the game, Nemesis was this ever-present, tough-as-nails threat that just wouldn't stop pursuing you. Mr. X in the previous game's remake gave people a lot of hope for how Nemesis would turn out in this game. Well, in this game you'd think he was an Uncharted villain because most of the time he's just harassing you during set pieces. The reason he was so intimidating in the original version was because you never quite knew when he would pop up. Save for a few exceptions in this game, most of the time when he's menacing you, it's in some kind of big, bombastic, scripted chase type of sequence, or a boss battle. There are a few instances where he's just walking the streets of Raccoon City and is an obstacle in the way of where you are trying to go, and that's when he works best. The problem is that a lot of the time he's just point A, and point B is anywhere but here. It worked well enough in the moment on my first playthrough, but, you know, Mr. X, looking back, is a better Nemesis than Nemesis is in this game. That's not to say the experience was completely ruined, obviously I still enjoyed the game a lot. I guess, you know, we can just wait for the Resident Evil 4 remake. There's no way they'll mess up Salazar. I'm going to start by saying that I apologize if I get any of the details in this part wrong. I don't make it a point to replay the games on the list before I talk about them, and the launch of Doom Eternal feels like it happened 10 years ago. Anyway, Doom Eternal is an immaculate, adrenaline-filled masterpiece. It takes place shortly after the end of Doom 2016 and kicks it up another notch right there from the beginning. The gameplay of Doom Eternal is just as action-packed as the previous outing. The main difference I'd say is that this one is more of a thinking man's game. Since the game is much harder, killing the enemies in a manner that will yield the drop you need is rather important. Glory killing enemies yields health, setting them on fire and killing them will yield armor, and killing them with the chainsaw will yield ammo. Chances are you're always going to be needing one or more of these things, so getting a good grasp on what to do when is vital. Aside from that, the game comes with new enemies, most of which are welcome additions, except for the Archviles. Screw those guys. One thing I happened to enjoy quite a bit was the pseudo-dismemberment mechanic that was present, where if you just shoot specific parts of certain enemies, that part will become inoperable to them. Shooting the Spider-Bot's tail is a good example of this. Outside of the combat, Doom Eternal spices up the level design with a bunch of kinetic platforming sections too. This could be off-putting to some people, but I thought it was a nice way to change up the pace without being tedious. On top of that, there's a lot more visual variety in the level design of this game. When the improved combat and level design come together with the suitably bombastic music and equally as wacky story, it all makes for a thrilling experience that rarely takes its foot off the gas. Just thinking about it has me in the mood to go slay some demons again. Maybe I should check out the expansion. Oh man, Eichenfell is a vibe and a half. Every time I played it, I wanted to curl up in a blanket before starting. The game centers around Mariette, an ordinary girl going to track down her sister Safina, a witch, at her magic school, Eichenfell. Safina didn't come home to visit, so Mary was worried and pursued her. And without getting too into the details on the plot, everything that could complicate the search for Safina did complicate the search for Safina. The combat in this game is this cool grid-based RPG system, mixed in with some timing mechanics from something like Paper Mario. If those timing mechanics aren't your speed, you can adjust them to be less important or shut them off entirely. There's also an instant win button if you want there to be. Yeah, that probably sounds like hearsay to an old school RPG enthusiast, but it's actually a nice way to mitigate the tedium of constant random encounters or grinding. Sometimes you just want to move on after you've proven that you can kill the 5 enemies in the area so many times. And to be honest, I wish more RPGs had something like this. The older I get, the less patience I have for something like grinding. The two best things Eichenfell has going for it are the music and the cast of characters. The music sets the tone for every area, battle, scene, and character impeccably. And the characters are all rather endearing. They all come from various walks of life and deal with their own struggles in truly interesting ways. I was pleased to watch them all overcome their struggles in what turned out to be a rather heartfelt story. Overall, the unique gameplay mixed with the stellar atmosphere and great cast made for a delightful experience that had me under its spell the whole way through. Well, you know, anytime you give me something related to Breath of the Wild, I'm gonna chomp at the bit to play it. Honestly though, using the Musou formula to portray the events of the Great Calamity is a pretty smart move. Thankfully, there's a little more to it than just being a Dynasty Warriors game. Some of the systems from Breath of the Wild carry over. Flurry rushes can be done to larger enemies, and each character has access to the Sheikah Slate runes as well. Cool thing about the Sheikah Slate is that while every character can use it, they all use it differently. For example, if Link uses the bombs, he'll throw several of them in rapid succession. If Zelda uses the bombs, she'll summon this big bomb with spider legs that drops other bombs. There's a cool bit of flavor that makes each of them feel different even if the general utility is the same. They managed to nail the fighting styles, too. Link is a solid introductory character, good fundamentals with nothing too ridiculous. Impa is centered around manipulating her seals and image clones. Revali focuses on aerial combos, and Urbosa, Dr. Urbosa, she's fast, hits like a truck, and her main mechanic is really cool. She has a lightning meter that enhances her strong attack. It can be refilled by standing still and pressing ZR, or you can push ZR at the end of a combo and get a section of the meter back. Her fighting style was probably my favorite and the one I got the most mileage out of aside from Link. There were a few characters I didn't really vibe with, but I put that more on me not taking the time to learn them, rather than them being bad. The game manages to give you plenty to do outside of the main story as well. In between story chapters, you're sent to a map of Hyrule with extra missions and errands to do for the people of Hyrule. Each region even gets a community meter, and you get gifts every time it fills up. It reminds me of something like the War Table from Dragon Age Inquisition. I thought it was a nice touch. As for the story, because it was set as a prequel to Breath of the Wild, I was quite interested going in. It provided a bunch of cool character moments in isolation, but as a whole, I don't think the story quite clicks together right. It's alright though, I sort of temper my expectation for spin-offs anyway. I was willing to take the cool moments as they came, and let them carry me through the rest of it. All in all, I found Age of Calamity to be an enjoyable revisiting of Hyrule. They managed to show me more of the world and characters that I was enjoying, in a way that I don't think would have been done in a traditional Zelda game. It feels wild that I'm actually talking about a remake of Final Fantasy VII this year. It barely felt real when it got announced 5 years ago, and being generous, I thought I'd be waiting at least another 5 years for it. The crazier thing is that the game actually turned out to be pretty good. I'll start with the gameplay. They adjusted the combat to be more of an action RPG leaning type of system, but critically, the ATB meter is still in the game. Once a section of the meter is filled up, you can slow down time and pick the move that would be most beneficial for you to use. The slow motion effect, coupled with the fact that you'll normally wreck your opposition with whatever you choose, makes the usage of the ATB meter some of the most satisfying gameplay I've felt all year. There are also command shortcuts if you want to lean further into the action RPG kind of gameplay. Which, to be fair, anytime I was in control of Tifa, I found that I did like setting her moves to the command shortcuts and chaining them together. Another vital thing about this game that they got right for the combat, Square has finally nailed that stagger mechanic that they're so fixated on. They've been trying to implement a stagger meter into what feels like all of their major releases since Final Fantasy XIII. So for about a decade they've been tinkering with this mechanic, and they finally got it to feel good. I couldn't really tell you what they did differently. It's been far too long since I've played Final Fantasy XIII for that, and 15 is little more than a repressed memory at this point. The point is that Final Fantasy VII Remake finally did it right. The progression system in this game is cool too. As far as the materia is concerned, that remains unchanged from the original iteration. You level it up by using it, and it yields better spells after a certain experience threshold. The materia can be swapped in between characters and the progress carries over. This is really nice because there are several times throughout the game where you're locked to a specific party, so not having to start from scratch on the magic is rather helpful. The weapons in this game are also pretty cool because it's not just an outright stat boost from the previous weapon you had. They're all more of like side grades that have their own little points that you can spend. So the Buster Sword may be really good at attacking physically, but Cloud's second sword that he gets might be better for like enhancing your magic. It's a cool bit of side grade that doesn't immediately obsolete the previous weapon. It's just all up to how you want to play. So the gameplay is solid, but what about the story and characters? A big point of contention for some people, myself included to a certain extent, was back when Square revealed that the game was only going to cover Midgar. The term episodic kept getting attached to the game, and I believe that is an inaccurate way to look at it. When I think of the term episodic video game, I think of something like a Telltale game, where they take a 10-hour game and chunk it up into 5 2-hour parts with conveniently placed cliffhangers. There was nothing stopping that from just being one 10-hour game. This feels more like the first part of a trilogy. I feel like if I take the game on how it's presenting itself to me, and not my prior knowledge of how long the story actually is, it feels like a complete experience. A complete experience with an obvious sequel hook maybe, but a complete experience nonetheless. I thought that all the expanding that they did worked wonders to flesh out Midgar and the characters we meet. I think there are two really solid examples of this, the first being the Avalanche crew. In the original version of the game, we barely got to know them, and in this version I'd say I'd like them all to a certain extent, some more than others. My favorite of the three was Jesse, but they all play off of each other and Cloud really well. The other example of them improving on older things is Eris. I did not care for her at all in the original version, but I happen to like her quite a bit in this one. She comes off as much more human and way less living plot device. I think all of the other characters are done pretty well too. Barret and Tifa are great, and Cloud finally feels like Cloud again. He definitely leans more towards the original portrayal of guy who is good at what he does, but also kind of a jerk, and way less of the I'm going to ride my motorcycle and sigh a lot portrayal that always seemed to come with him afterwards. So yeah, purists may not be totally in love with the liberties that the game took with their holiest of treasures, but I think that Final Fantasy VII Remake crucially captures the spirit of the series that I don't think I'd felt since the days of the PS2. The music and overall feeling of this game is something that once again feels like I can only get it from a Final Fantasy game, and I think that excitement is what carried me through the game and what has me so interested to see how this unknown journey shakes out. Oh, Baby Supergiant does it again. Before I get too far in, I'm going to mention that I have a review up of this game. The link will be in the description, so go there for a more even and focused take, because from here on out it's just fanboy gushing. The funniest thing about this game is that I don't even really like roguelikes that much. I've dabbled in Rogue Legacy and Binding of Isaac here and there, but I never really went beyond the experiment and die phase. The setup for Hades is that Zagreus, the Prince of the Underworld, is trying to escape to the human realm. The reasons for this are made clear later on in the story. Hades takes the fact that you're going to die a lot and contextualizes it into the story, and I think that's really cool. The game takes advantage of its structure and delivers the world and story to you in a way that could only be done in that kind of game. As far as the gameplay is concerned, I already mentioned that it's a roguelike. The combat takes a hack and slash kind of approach. You can select one of 6 weapons. The cool thing about them is that while I took a shine to certain ones, like the spear, upon unlocking them, I found all of them to be viable in their own right after trying them out a little more. So each weapon has a regular attack and then a special attack that's more specific to the weapon. For example, the spear can be thrown, the bow can shoot off a volley of arrows. You get the point. Zagreus also gets a dash maneuver, which is good for dodging or closing the distance between you and a monster that you're fighting. He also gets what the game calls a cast, which is like a long-ranged magic attack. Once you're locked and loaded, you'll come across the crux of the gameplay, the boons that you get from the gods of Olympus. These boons are modifications that serve to buff Zagreus in some form or fashion, be it movement speed, revenge damage, or giving attacks damage over time. Each action you do can be buffed, so by the end of the run, the chances of your attacks, cast, and dash being wildly different from how they started is a very strong possibility. Each god of Olympus corresponds with something too. Athena is being able to reflect, Poseidon is knockback, Artemis is crit damage. It's all very cool. A lot of boons can play nice with each other as well. Okay, so you can't have 2 boons modify the exact same thing. For example, you can't have your special do Poseidon's knockback and Ares' damage over time. But you could, for example, have your special do one of those and then take a speed buff from Hermes. Since that doesn't change what the attack does, it just makes it go faster. Certain combos have the potential to be game-changing. One time I gave my regular attack a reflect from Athena and a speed boost from Hermes, and I was untouchable. It was awesome. Outside of smacking around the souls of the dead, while you're out in the dungeon there's also a number of collectibles you can grab to either permanently upgrade Zagreus, temporarily upgrade him for a better chance at your current run, or you'll also come across things that let you make modifications back at the House of Hades. Every time you die you get sent back to the House of Hades, which serves as the hub world where the land of the dead truly comes to life. Outside of a few characters you meet out in the dungeon, this is where the lion's share of the character interaction and story unfolds. It's really cool because the characters aren't just rigidly stuck in place, they move around or just don't show up. Sometimes Achilles isn't at his post, sometimes Dusa is tending to the lounge, sometimes Hades is crushing the hopes and dreams of the souls of the dead as they line up to be judged. This is a good way to drip feed you the story, and crucially, it keeps you from running out of new interactions. You could probably try to escape over 100 times and still have new dialogue to see. I know I've seen the credits and have come nowhere close to seeing everything the game has. The characters you talk to also extend beyond the "oh shucks, you died, you'll get them next time." They actually have their own subplots that play out the more that you talk to them. They were some of the best moments in the game too, and it made me genuinely excited to see what everyone had to say every time I died. The music and visuals in this game are impeccable as well. I knew from the title screen that I was in for a treat. Zagreus' spiffy portrait and No Escape, the title music playing, it was a good tone setter. Look at these characters, there's not a bad design here. I think it says a lot that even Zeus and Poseidon look striking, considering how different interpretations of them always pop up across fiction. My favorite characters from a design standpoint are Nyx, Megara, and Thanatos. As previously mentioned, the music is on another level in this game. It's ambient and tone setting when it has to be, and outright blood pumping during the combat. Some of my favorite songs include Good Riddance, Out of Tartarus, and God of the Dead. Okay, I think I've gushed over just about every element there is in this game. The way that everything about Hades manages to feed into and build upon itself is really impressive. The tagline for When You Die is, "There is no escape," and honestly that doesn't sound too bad to me. I'd gladly spend eternity playing this game.